Thank you for being here. We're starting on time because we have a very great and large panel. So if we want to stay in the 1 hour that we hope to stay in, we have to start on time. So I'm Lenny Kessler. I'm heading the ESG committee here for CFA Society France, and I'm very happy to hear you all. After climate that we talked about in the last events, we wanted to address biodiversity. This is part of our series on Earth, Wind, and Fire, as we like to call it. So biodiversity is indeed a key subject. We don't necessarily feel the problem daily in our lives, but we know most of what we do and live actually depends on the biodiversity. And it's about time that finance focuses on the subject. So with that said, there will be Zoom instructions in the chat if you need, and you can ask any Q&A in the chat. We will address them at the end. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Refinitiv, part of the London Stock Exchange Group. So thank you again, and thank Monica Hebreanu, who's online, who has assembled this great panel for us today. Monica is volunteering at the CFA Society France, both in the ESG committee and the advocacy committee. But she's also, in real life, the founder of Impact Plus, a startup assisting financial institutions to embed environmental and social factors into their activities, risk management, and disclosures. So thank you, Monica, for being there.
Thank you, Lenny, for a great introduction, and thanks to the panelists for joining us today. Thanks to the CFA France for the opportunity to have a panel on biodiversity. I think it's great to be here in front of financial analysts speaking about this, talking about this topic. I think we came a long way, and well, we have to remain humble of how long of a journey it's ahead of us. But I'm very excited to be here and to welcome our panelists. The first one is Anna Klaver. Anna is the head of Robeco Iberia, US Offshore and LATAM. Welcome, Anna. It's great to have you tonight.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our second panelist will be Charlotte Gardes, climate change, energy, and financial stability expert at the IMF. So thank you, Charlotte, for being here.
Thank you for hosting me.
Our next panelist is Sébastien Soleil, Head of Energy and Ecological Transition at BNP Paribas. Welcome, Sébastien. It's great to have you.
Our fourth panelist is Elena Filipova. So she's Director of Sustainable Finance at Refinitiv, now part of the London Stock Exchange Group. Thank you, Elena, for being here.
Pleasure and honor to be sharing the virtual stage with all of you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. And finally, we have Jessica Smith, who's the nature lead at the Nature Initiative at the United Nations Environmental Program for Financial Institutions, in short, UNEP-FI. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Monica, and everyone. Look forward to our session today.
Thank you so much for joining. So we thought that for diving in biodiversity, nobody's better than Sir David Attenborough. We suggest to start with just a minute 40 video about what biodiversity is per Sir David Attenborough. So Kaylin, thank you for starting the projection.
Biodiversity is a term that represents the total variety of all life on Earth. That's a big thing to sum up. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, billions of different individuals, and the trillions of different characteristics they all have. The total biodiversity of our planet is immense. Which is a good thing, because the more biodiversity, the more secure all life on Earth is, including ourselves. Only when life is at its most varied, vigorous, biodiverse, can we hope to thrive. We may not know it, but we need towering forests across 1/3 of the land surface to lock away carbon and keep the climate stable. We need millions of pollinators and billions of soil organisms and megatons of plankton to keep the food we eat in supply. We need strange plants deep in jungles to create our medicines, and coral reefs and mangrove swamps to protect the coasts we depend upon. Our planet's biodiversity provides all the things we need for free. But it will only do so if there's lots of it. And at the moment, it's under attack.
Thank you so much, Kelin, for this video. It's indeed a great introduction.
Thank you. So with this, let's dive in directly. Maybe Jessica, to start with on the biodiversity loss. I know UNEP FI has a nature program. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Great, thank you very much. Well, yes, UNEP FI has a program dealing with nature, and it's very closely interrelated with climate. So we consider nature, the thin film of life around our planet, including the 71% of the Earth that's made up of the oceans. And businesses in the real economy both impact and depend on the values that are created by nature and the resources that we use in our economy. And then in turn, investors are at risk from material biodiversity loss, nature loss, climate change. At the same time, climate change is a major issue that financial institutions have set targets on and committed to net zero transition. And we need nature to provide solutions. Science is suggesting that around 37% of the solutions to meeting climate targets could come from nature, but nature is being rapidly eroded. So this slide comes from Professor Sir Robert Watson, who's chaired the intergovernmental panels for both climate change and biodiversity. So that's very unique. And it just really outlines that we're at a massive crisis in terms of nature loss. 75% of land has been significantly altered. 90% is projected to be altered by 2050. 1 million species are expected to be extinct in the coming years. And more than 85% of our wetlands, which are really important for water management, drought and flood protection, have been lost. So it's a very serious situation. Many of you will already be familiar with, plastic in the oceans, other concerns like that, but it really has a material effect on business risk that needs to be identified and managed. At the same time, if we can go to the next slide, there's also an opportunity for investors and for businesses in the real economy. So the World Economic Forum has estimated that around 395 million new jobs and business opportunities could be generated by 2030 by investing in nature. And nature has become really an interesting investment theme because it's counter-cyclical and it can be responsive to impact investors who are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals. So it links to Sustainable Development Goals 14, 15 particularly, but also 13 and others. So some market research has suggested that investor interest is surging, and UNEP FI's research identified at least 50 new private finance innovations that came to market for nature last year. These are particularly relevant in emerging markets and the global south, so quite important opportunities for portfolio diversification. And right now we can see that only 14% of finance for nature is coming from private sources, but we expect this to be much larger in the coming years and also linked to nature-based solutions to climate change, where many investors and other institutions have set firm targets. So UNEP FI, if we can go to the next slide, we work across banking, insurance, and we work through the principles for responsible investment with the 5,000 PRI signatories in something called the Investment Leadership Program. And we create guidance, norms, standards. We build capacity around nature, biodiversity, natural capital. We provide tools such as Encore, which is a tool for exploring natural capital risks, opportunities, and exposure. And we're working across a number of market initiatives, including with the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge and Foundation, which more than 90, I think nearly 100 signatories now, particularly investors, have signed up to and are leading the market on this topic. So I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Lenny, and we'll look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So we'll hear more about the UNEP-FI work later on. I thought now I will turn to Charlotte to hear about the work of the International Monetary Fund in this space and in general, how international supervisors approach biodiversity and nature. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Monica. I hope you guys can hear me well, and I'm very happy to talk to you about that today. And I would say that despite, the message brought by David Attenborough, there's always a question that must be answered from the perspective of financial supervisors and central banks. And it's the one of, is biodiversity loss an endogenous source of macro financial risk? So this question is fundamental to actually, let's say, target the role of financial supervisors themselves. So one point that is ultimately important is the fact that biodiversity and the ecosystem services it provides do play a critical role in the functioning of our economy. So a wide range of industries, and not only the agricultural sector, heavily depend on ecosystem services. And the fact that biodiversity loss is both unprecedented and currently accelerating is an area of concern as well, because never in human history we have witnessed and measured, therefore, the effects and the consequences of that loss. So what is most important from the point of view of a financial supervisor is that natural capital is non-substitutable. So it means that the regulating services that are provided by natural capital cannot be replaced by labor or by financial capital. So no other type of capital can actually replace the role that biodiversity plays in water availability and regulation, in pollination, or in nutrient cycling, for instance. And from that concern, let's say there are two types of risks that are climate and environmental related that also stem from biodiversity loss. Physical risks, transition risks, and what is particularly relevant is that these physical and transition risks, they could reinforce each other in the agricultural and the fishing sectors, for instance. So that is why contagion channels could arise between different risks and then feed back to the economy. And for these reasons, you can have price stability that is actually affected. And biodiversity loss, for instance, that stems from deforestation activities leads to higher frequency and more severe droughts across the globe that impact agricultural yields, but also hydropower production, for instance. And it has recently been witnessed in India and in Western Europe. And in its most recent report, the IPCC has shown that these impacts are global and will not spare any continent from these effects. So in turn, these impacts may raise food and electricity prices and contribute to a rise in headline inflation. And so the NGFS has, for instance, found that biodiversity loss mitigation measures could also impact commodity and related prices. And finally, I would say there is a nexus between biodiversity loss and climate change. The Glasgow Climate Pact signed during COP26 has actually emphasized that relation by insisting on the role of ecosystems in storing carbon and ensuring climate regulation. It has been shown in the video as well. So it's an essential element of carbon neutrality. And on the other hand, you have climate change that is a key driver of biodiversity loss, for instance, via deforestation. So these interactions lead to biodiversity-related physical and transition risks that are more, let's say, prone to compound, and as a result, to potentially generate systemic risks. So along these lines, I would like to stress three final points really quickly. The first one is that there's a variety of transmission channels to financial institutions. Because there is a high degree of complexity in interdependencies between ecosystems across the world. And these effects of biodiversity loss are indeed not only localized, but also global. And for three main reasons. The first one is that the regulating services that are provided by ecosystem services often cross borders, such as pollination, water regulation, or climate regulation. The second point is that you have the ongoing dismantling of crucial biomes, for instance, the Amazon rainforest, that have consequences on the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, and that spreads out beyond South America, obviously. And the third point is that there are potential cascading impacts along value chains. for the agricultural sector, for the fishing sector, for the textile industry. And these impacts can be found from emerging economies and developing economies, but also high-income countries alike through these second-round effects. So you have these interdependencies that may lead to disruptions in business operations, affecting market and credit risks, and shocks may impact economic agents through macroeconomic variables, for instance, a country's exchange rates and debt sustainability, but also global commodity prices, GDP growth prospects, and more of that. And they also may lead to zoonoses and therefore increased pandemic risks, leading to credit risks. So these risk transmission channels are very diverse, and it could be bank insolvency, effects on market liquidity, a rise in fire sales, and they may generate systemic risk. So if financial supervisors, in our view, want to act on the climate front by contributing to carbon neutrality by mid-century, therefore, they also need to consider ecosystems in the equation, considering these two legs of carbon neutrality that I have described earlier. But as we know, there are lots of measurement issues, and I think this seminar will answer that, because biodiversity is a complex, interconnected, and especially, and I think that's something really important to have in mind, non-fungible quality of ecosystems. So there are measurement debates in the scientific community itself, and it can be logistically and technically challenging. But on the contrary to greenhouse gas emissions, there cannot be one single metric or focus on a single ecosystem service or species. So for financial supervisors to step up, and the IMF in particular, considering its global role to preserve financial stability, we think that greater work must be ensured in this area. And I think that this seminar today will completely show that. I'll leave you the floor, Monica.
Thank you, Charlotte. So now we will turn to the private sector initiatives. And first off, we'll start with Anna. Robeco is a very active player in the field. Can you tell us a bit more about your initiatives on biodiversity?
Okay, for sure. Lenny, thank you so much. Thanks a lot to all the audience for being here today. It's a pleasure not only to represent Robeco as the asset manager and also part of the CFA Society here in Spain. I'm the head of the sustainability and the chair of the sustainability committee, and also part of the board member here in the Spanish Society. So it's really good to participate in this event. As you were also mentioning, Lenny, I mean, Robeco has been working not only in the climate change, but also in the biodiversity arena for quite a long time already. And we have incorporated also biodiversity in our annual surveys to our investors to try to calibrate, to measure what is the importance of biodiversity nowadays in the investment space, in our investors, in the financial industry. And in general, I mean, the main conclusion is there is still a lack of awareness regarding biodiversity. I think people are becoming more familiar with climate change, but not really with biodiversity and the problem that is behind the biodiversity. But on the other side, the willingness is to really incorporate and to have biodiversity in their investment portfolio. So it's true that there is like a lack of awareness, but at the same time, there is a willingness and the hope to incorporate biodiversity and nature into their portfolios, which are really very good news. If we go to the next slide, we can just summarize what Robeco is doing in biodiversity, because we have also incorporated biodiversity such a long time ago in our engagement programs. So this is part of our engagement themes that we are working with the companies we invest. But now we are doing more things, and it's just mainly because we think that the financial sector really has a big responsibility in trying to tackle the biodiversity loss. It's not something that is simply nice to have in the context of sustainability investing. It's also in the long-term interest of our clients and on our investment performance, because it's also our duty to do our best for the planet. And when I say it's also in the benefit of our investment performance, is because we know that the implication of the biodiversity loss to the economy and the economic impact is so big that it could be even larger than the climate change impact. So it's really a systematic risk around biodiversity. And that's why in 2019, when the IPBES report gave a global alarm bell about biodiversity loss, Robeco started to look at it, trying to find different kind of solutions and to incorporate biodiversity into our portfolios. Because as you know, and it was mentioned in here before, biodiversity is now declining faster than at any other time in human history. So we really need to do something in order to avoid that systematic risk and implications behind that. So that's why Robeco, a part of addressing biodiversity issues with that dedicated engagement program that I was mentioning before, related to commodity-related deforestation, for example, we are also trying to partner with different kind of global entities to have a bigger and a larger scale, and to do, to have a higher impact worldwide, because one of the key challenges in biodiversity is that data. Trying to get updated data to incorporate in our investment decisions. So that's why also we have partnering with the Worldwide Fund for Nature in order to make sure that we are able to share knowledge with them, that we are able to incorporate new data into our investment decisions, and also to be able to launch products and strategies that are taking into account biodiversity in all those strategies. So it's very important for us to build knowledge, but also to build awareness that biodiversity loss needs to be tackling in the financial industry. And that's what Robeco is mainly doing at this moment. We also signed in 2019 the Biodiversity Pledge, in which Robeco committed to measure biodiversity in our portfolios, and also to be able to steer our strategies into biodiversity. So we are trying just to measure and to be able to incorporate data into our portfolio measurement regarding biodiversity. And we have committed in 2024 as the latest to report on biodiversity in all our portfolios. So that's something that we are working on it right now, trying to develop that data, trying to develop that that framework, and also to find partnerships to really to accelerate this process.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. We actually thought of Robeco because of your involvement in sustainability for so many years, and your work on biodiversity, which we spotted thanks to the case study that was put together with the Dutch National Bank on their biodiversity initiative. So thanks a lot for taking the time to join us today. We know you have a very, very, very difficult agenda this week, and you'll have to leave at 7. So thanks a lot for joining. A lot of work ahead of us, but it's clearly great to hear from asset managers like yourself on how you lead the way forward, I would say. So thanks.
No, thank you, Monica, for sure. It's true that there are so many challenges and obstacles to overcome, but they can't stop asset managers to make progress, to make steps, and to try to incorporate biodiversity in our portfolios.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Jessica will tell us the same, and she's also tell us about some of the awareness efforts they are doing at their level, as you with Robeco do as well. So thanks a lot, and have a great evening. I know you have limited time. I will now turn it to Sebastian. We know also BNP Paribas has various initiatives on biodiversity. While researching for this panel, I actually found out that BNP Paribas is the first founding member of IPBES, so the International Panel on Biodiversity is the equivalent of the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity, the equivalent of the climate IPCC, but for biodiversity. So that's impressive, but I would say the important thing here is how we divert capital flows, lending and investments towards activities that are respectful of biodiversity. And I will turn it to you, Sebastian, to tell us more about the commitments BNP Paribas has put in place.
Thank you, Monica. So yes, what we first tried to do was to assess our impacts, our indirect impacts on biodiversity. For this, we rely quite a lot on the drives and try and assess what certain drivers for each of our business lines. So it enables us to define priorities in terms of biodiversity in our operation with our clients and with the companies in which we invest. So the first thing we decided to do was to integrate biodiversity-related criteria in our financing and investment policies to limit what we're willing to finance or not. And especially since there is a high deforestation in Brazil, as you all know. Last year, we decided to stop working with companies which were unable to stop deforestation by 2025 for those who were purchasing soy and beef in Brazil, and especially in the Amazon and in the Cerrado region. So quite stringent criteria on deforestation for Brazil, soy and beef. And we were very proud to see Global Canopy, which issue every 2 years, I think, a ranking on deforestation policies, ranked BNP Paribas as the first out of 150 major financial institutions, thanks to this, mostly to this policy. So it's the first step. The first step is limiting what we want to finance. And then we want to work positively with our clients, and we want to help our clients in their transition to a more sustainable economy and to a more, an economy that is more positive or less negative to biodiversity. And so last year we began to support the position of our clients for an amount of 4 billion, so 1 billion for marine biodiversity and 3 billion euros for terrestrial biodiversity. So we are here to help our clients when they need financing to preserve biodiversity. And we have several other commitments. So for instance, we want to support startups dedicated to ecology transition. And I would like to highlight what Charlotte and Anna just said. So Charlotte highlighted the measurement issues and the complexity of biodiversity. And so that's, and Anna highlighted the lack of awareness, the importance with knowledge. So that's why for us, it's very important to be very active in coalitions between the problem of awareness, the problem of data, the problem of measurement of capacity can be efficiently addressed if we gather strong and relevant coalitions. So for instance, why we were very instrumental in the founding of the TNFD, the Task Force on Natural and Financial Disclosure, because it's very important for us to work together with other corporates, other institutions, to build robust, transparent frameworks to assess, manage, and disclose biodiversity-related risk and opportunity. I think I will come back to it later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sébastien. Now I'll turn to Elena, because Refinitiv is obviously one of the main players in the data, and we've heard already from pretty much everybody that data is the key problem, key challenge. So how can you help us there?
Thank you, Lenny, and indeed great conversation so far. Data is a challenge, but let's not use it as an excuse to delay action. It's, I guess, my key message to our listeners and audience today. It is very similar to the situation with climate and climate change. Data has always been used as one of the reasons to delay action, and that makes then the journey a lot harder. we've spoken a lot about the topic in general terms, and I think it's really important to understand where we are in terms of data availability and where we need to be aiming to go towards to be more effective in measuring and managing biodiversity and nature-related risks, as well as from a business perspective to grasp the opportunities that the transition of the global economy is creating for market participants around the world. So I thought of just putting a couple of slides, and what you see here is more than just the topic of conversation today, which is biodiversity, but as the panelists before me already quite adequately explained, biodiversity and other nature-related themes are very closely interconnected and interdependent to each other, to climate and climate change. So it is good to look at it within the context. The good news from this data analysis that I did for our conversation today is that data availability is growing, and it's growing at a rapid pace. And there are different factors for it. We like to describe the market moving forces in two ways. There is a push and a pull factor. The push factor is the rise in regulation, and especially for all of us at the European Union, we do feel quite a lot of momentum behind the sustainable finance agenda, and we see this as a very strong push factor. But there is a critically important pull factor, which is market-led. It's the investors asking companies for this information. And let's also remember that all ESG data we have at our disposal today is as a result of that pull factor, because ESG reporting, broadly speaking, is done on a voluntary basis. So investors are a very significant force and should be mobilized to ensure that we get the data that we need around biodiversity to inform our investment and financing decisions. Focusing on biodiversity, what's really interesting from a data perspective, that the type of disclosure that we find today tends to be very generic, very descriptive. And it was mentioned already on the panel today by Charlotte, I believe, that when it comes to climate, it is now a little bit easier for us to understand it because we have one metric to measure and manage. That's the GHG emissions. When it comes to biodiversity, there is no one metric, and that makes it a lot more complex for the industry to quantify the risks, understand the impact, both negative and positive, but also not only at one company at a time, but at one investment portfolio at a time. And think about different multi-asset class investments and mapping that information from portfolio to investable entity back to the asset level data, which is where the exposure to biodiversity happens, is a long journey with lots of question marks and complexities that we have to overcome. And the next slide speaks quite nicely of another data challenge, which is not unique to biodiversity or nature-related assets. It's actually general across all sustainability teams, that the focus historically has been around large cap companies, and that's where we see much more disclosure available. And as you go down to mid-cap and small-cap organization, the level of data available rapidly decreases. And there are various reasons for that. Currently, the cost to do the assessment and aggregate the data and report it for organizations is quite high as a result of the too many standards out there that tell companies how to do it. There is no one way of approaching it, and that increases the cost for implementation. This is where we believe that the creation of ISSB last year by the IFRS Foundation at COP26 is so important, and we have very high hopes that it will enable the market to get a lot closer to a global reporting standard. And biodiversity is part of that reporting standard. And I have another slide, which I'll very quickly browse through to lay some foundations for some of the conversation we're going to have later today around how do you break the whole challenge that is kind of put on financial markets by regulators, by all of us, by consumers, by people, to shift capital from bad to good. You really cannot expect that to happen overnight. You have to break the problem into chunks. And the logical way to do it is by focusing on the areas of greatest impact. So we don't have to solve for everything for the full economy. We don't have to decarbonize the full economy day one. We don't have to understand the impact of every industry on biodiversity, but let's focus on the hotspots, and that's where the big wins are going to happen. Back to you, Lenny.
Thank you so much, Elena. We alternate, so it's my turn. Indeed, the data is one of the points discussed very often. We don't have to stop at that. I like the start of your speech, Elena. It's we have to overcome that and move forward, step by baby step. And so I would like now to maybe turn it to Jessica. The audience is probably familiar by now with the TCFD initiative, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. A lot of companies worldwide and a lot of financial services firms report under that framework. Last year, UNEP-FI initiated a similar initiative on nature, TNFD. So Jessica, can you tell us more about this initiative and where you are and how you are moving forward?
Sure, absolutely. So UNEP-FI worked last year with UNDP, Global Canopy, and WWF to initiate the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So very much the inspiration came from the TCFD, and now we have more than 30 task force members and several hundred task force forum members, dozens of knowledge partners and others who are now involved in the TNFD. So the TNFD beta framework was released in March with a set of draft recommendations that very much mirror what would be familiar from the TCFD. But as other speakers have mentioned, the topic of nature is much more complex. So the scope of the framework is much larger. So this just gives you an overview of what TNFD is calling realms, biomes, assets, ecosystem services that are within the scope of the TNFD. And atmosphere is considered within the scope of the TCFD. So they're very much complementary frameworks, and the TNFD and TCFD have been closely in touch to make sure that we continue to keep it a complementary framework. So there are literally thousands of metrics around nature and biodiversity, but that's unmanageable. As you can expect, many in the market really need to see harmonization of these metrics to have a manageable dashboard of indicators. If we can't get to individual, single indicators, we need a dashboard of maybe a few dozen indicators. So we're looking at a scope of maybe 35 to 50, which would be like headline common indicators for disclosure that are expected to emerge over the coming piloting and refining that's happening in the TNFD process. But actually the number of assessed metrics would be much larger within corporates and FIs to actually get to a number that you disclose publicly. So there is a little bit more emphasis through what's called the LEAP framework, which starts with location. So this is a slight difference again from the TCFD, that there is more focus on the assessment in-house as a more elaborated step before you get to the disclosure. So, I think one of the main goals here is to actually get to, harmonized, consistent disclosures And the TNFD is working very much with a range of jurisdictions, a range of standard setters to really make sure we have an umbrella framework that, other standards and, individual requirements, sector requirements can hook in. And actually, I have to mention that the TNFD is co-chaired by David Craig, who's the former CEO of Refinitiv, and Elizabeth Marima, who's the executive secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And actually, it's a really exciting moment in the international policy landscape right now, because a 10-year biodiversity strategy called the Global Biodiversity Framework is being finalized this year after a several years negotiation process between most of the governments of the world. And Elizabeth leads this process, but she also co-chairs this market-led process. So she's really working at the intersection between market leadership and regulators. So actually what we're seeing is that within the Global Biodiversity Framework, there is a target, number 15, that is in draft right now, that's calling for the disclosure of impacts and dependencies related to nature by financial institutions and corporates and other entities. So actually, we're expecting a much more rapid uptake of the TNFD nature-related risk disclosure, particularly into policy in different jurisdictions, on the back of both the familiarity of central banks, financial supervisors, et cetera, with TCFD and the argument for acting on climate and the links between climate and biodiversity, and then now having it really baked into international policy. So there's a lot happening in this space, and investors should be really researching this and anticipating that there's going to be a rapid action from regulators as compared to TCFD, which climate-related risk took a lot longer to figure out and sort of come into practice. But now I think the stage is set. Okay, great. So I'll hand. I think that's my last slide then on TNFD. So I'll hand back to you, Monica.
Thank you, Jessica. We are certainly happy to hear that things are moving faster than to TCFD, considering the emergency. Now, there are practical challenges associated with this. We mentioned measurements, data, etc. I thought, Sebastian, I can turn it to you to get a quick reaction from a practitioner view on the TNFD beta version.
Yes, so the first beta version was released in March. The second one will be released in June, and I think there will be many improvements in the second beta version. Jessica said already many interesting things about this beta version, and as she said, we expect that it will take less time than the TCFD. We think that if the TNFD is applied by enough companies, it will be able to create the disclosure of biodiversity-related information, and it will be much easier for financial institutions such as BNP Paribas and many others to assess the impacts on biodiversity of their portfolio, credit portfolio, or asset management portfolio. And it's very important because we are very dependent as financial institutions on the information that corporates will be able to disclose. So the more information and the more robust information we can get from these corporates, the easier it will be for financial institutions to address seriously waste and opportunities related to biodiversity. And that's why we have very high expectation both on the TNFD framework and on the way corporates and companies will use this framework in the coming months and years after the final recommendation will be released in September 2023.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Thank you. So indeed, we are looking forward to these new versions, and it will be important to understand the data and methodological gap and all the operational implication that has for corporates and financial institutions as well. So we thought now we'll get a little bit a sense of who is our audience today. So Sonia will be running a quick poll and then we'll go into the second part of this panel. I forgot to announce it at the beginning. The first part was private sector initiatives with the international UNEP-FI and the IMF work. And the second part is going to be more focused on regulation and supervision. But first, the poll. To get a sense from which type of institution you come and in which role you play, let's say. So I don't know if I have to read the questions on the screen, but you are invited to vote. So what best describes your institution activities? Asset management, bank, insurance, pension funds, or others? That's a quick question, easy. And then the second question is what best describes your roles focus? Is that financial ESG analysis, portfolio management, risk management, finance and investor reporting? So hopefully we didn't miss too many categories. So I'll invite you to vote. We'll give it a few seconds. And then we'll go into the second part of the panel. So actually what you see on this slide at the back of the poll is the overwhelming activity. And I say overwhelming in a good sense, because we are finally taking actions and measures on these topics. To the left of the circle, you see what we talked about in this first part of the panel, which were the private sector initiatives. And now we'll focus on the right-hand side, which is the regulation and supervision that is moving, let's say, fast from the climate focus into biodiversity, particularly considering that everyone understands how interconnected they are. Sonia, do we need more time for the poll, or?
I will close it. No worries.
I mean, you can leave it open. Can you display the results, maybe?
Yes.
Great.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. So I see that we have quite a bit of participation from the asset management and also from the banking industry. Others, it's another presence. Thank you very much for voting. Thank you. We can leave it open if any other people would like to vote by the end of this webinar. Lenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. So now we'll dive into the fun part of the regulations and supervisors, which I'm sure everybody loves. But let's be honest, they're really helping us, as we already heard. So starting from the global, and we'll dive slowly back in. Maybe Charlotte, you could give us your view from the NGFS report. For those who don't know, the NGFS is the network of central banks for greening of the financial system. So what is your take on the agenda?
Thank you, Lenny. Actually, in my view, understanding the recommendations from the NGFS report that was published a few weeks ago, and that I totally encourage you to take a look at, we need to take a step back a little bit in order to better grasp actually the range of recommendations that were made and that are going to be taken on board actually by all NGFS members. I guess for that, we need to take into consideration the challenges for financial supervisors and central banks. And some of those have actually already been mentioned today, but let's say maybe we have three of them. The first one is that mitigating biodiversity risks means that we need data indeed, but we need consistent, transparent, and rigorous science-based metrics. And we lack those so far, even though progress has been done and is being done on the disclosure front in some regions. And even though some central banks and supervisors have already done actually a great deal of work in this area. The second difficulty is that biodiversity loss is global, but there is, for some ecosystems, a concentration of risks in some areas of the world. So measuring the transmission along global supply chains in some key sectors is particularly challenging from a technical and an operational perspective. And some emerging markets and developing economies are particularly commodity dependent, but so are some high-income countries that rely on these economies in some key sectors. So these spillovers must be analyzed, though it actually remains a challenge today. And the third one is that there is a lack of knowledge on the role of biodiversity, on the impacts and the dependencies of our economies to biodiversity. And that leads to mispricing of natural capital. So policies are still very scarce on this issue. And that leads to a lack of disincentives for investments that harm biodiversity, but also for those investments that can have a positive impact. So the NGFS report came with a series of actions for financial supervisors, and a task force on nature-related risks just got created. And there's a 2-year mandate with a great deal of work on the design of a conceptual framework, scenarios, and a lot of deep dives into ecosystem services. And as far as the International Monetary Fund is concerned, because it's got this role to preserve global financial stability that comes through a variety of ways, the recommendations that have been put forward by the NGFS report are very relevant. So in our department, in the Monetary and Capital Markets Department, we can do more or less 4 things. The first one is that in our policy work on data gaps and methodologies, but also on portfolio alignment approaches and taxonomies, we can integrate better biodiversity-related aspects. We are members, for instance, of the ISSB, so we can incorporate these issues into our advice to the ISSB. And the double materiality of biodiversity is actually really key from a financial perspective, a financial stability perspective, because we need to emphasize the fact that portfolio allocation choices, for instance, may have an increasing impact on pressures for biodiversity and drivers of biodiversity loss. We have to understand also, I mean, sort of not understand, but enhance, I would say, our understanding of the channels through which nature can affect financial stability and price stability. And we need further research in this area, and we need to start by case studies, for instance. And one really important point I want to address here to finish with is the fact that, and it's directly related to financial supervision actually, is that we must work on integrated approaches to assess biodiversity and climate-related financial risks. So our participation to this NGFS task force, but also to a task force on scenario design and analysis, will actually pursue this objective. So we must think about ways to integrate biodiversity in financial market surveillance at the IMF that materializes in a diversity of ways in advanced and emerging economies. And we have done that already for climate-related risks, performing a series of climate stress tests in the FSAPs that the IMF does. But the issue of scenarios is eminently difficult, and for 4 reasons. The first one is that there are difficulties linked to the establishment of links between biophysical and economic scenarios. Those difficulties are also linked to the multi-dimensional analysis that you have to perform when you identify trends in biodiversity dynamics and pressures on biodiversity by regions or by sector. The third one is that there are difficulties linked to the tipping points that are more prevalent in biodiversity than in climate. And there are issues related with the sort of decomposition that you can have of critical environmental functions in order to remain, for the humanity to remain in a safe operating space. And the last point is that there are very diffuse disaggregation effects through the economy. That's probably the most important point, especially when you hear financial supervisors saying that biodiversity loss is not a global, is maybe not a global financial stability risk. There are diffuse disaggregation effects throughout the economy. So the role of the supervisor is to monitor these low noise relationships between the progressive loss of ecosystems and biodiversity collapse. So this is a very difficult subject because the breakdown phenomena are not as linear as for other physical processes, such as, for instance, the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, where you have more research on the links between these low noises and the fact that at some point it can collapse. So that's why we have to design conceptual frameworks in financial supervision to incorporate these biodiversity-related risks. I would just want to point out, and then I stop here, that emerging markets and developing economies have actually done a great deal of work in this area, probably much more, and I want to stress that, than advanced economies, especially because 85%, I think, of the hotspots in biodiversity are actually located in these economies. And emerging markets and developing economies represent something like 15 out of 17 mega diverse countries globally. And we mean by that countries that harbor more than 60% of the world's biodiversity. So these countries are very highly vulnerable to biodiversity loss, especially if governments view biodiversity protection as a trade-off with economic growth and development. So it is imperative that we globally better understand how biodiversity loss affects financial and economic stability in the context of these emerging markets and developing economies. So that's the very role of financial supervision. And often in Europe, for instance, we have that very close view of Europe functioning by itself, when we are actually Europeans are very much, and I think the Ukraine war has shown that, related to these economies. So it's very much important to embed biodiversity loss into financial supervision for that reason as well.
Thank you, Charlotte. I was going to say it's this unfortunate war in Ukraine, tragic, I would say, it revealed some of these complexities. And I will actually, so it's a great perspective that you share there about the global interrelations. I would like to bring it now a little bit back to Europe, I would say, and turn it to Elena. Elena, you are a former member of the EU technical expert group that work on the EU green taxonomy. I would like to maybe comment on how biodiversity was tackled in that context and touch upon SFDR as well, if we have time. We are a little bit running out of time, but I suggest that we continue, and if we lose some members of the audience, they will be able to catch up on the recording on YouTube. So I suggest we continue. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica, and indeed time is not on our side. I will try to be as quick as possible. If we go to the next slide, I think just a very quick refresher that in 2018, the European Commission published the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance. And since then, it has been developing a number of very significant regulatory initiatives, text formulated a very ambitious agenda, followed by a number of delegated acts already in force, some in consultation phases, and the roadmap of sustainable intents. I will probably use that word to describe it. Others may use other words. But I think that what's very important is to highlight that this agenda strives to be an enabler to the market and drive towards transparency rather than the traditional regulation. And that's an important point to mention. Now, when we started tackling this challenge, I mentioned already that it's really important to break it into pieces. And this is the approach that European regulators adopted a couple of years ago when they started working on the regulation. And rightly so focused the initial work on climate-related parts of the regulation. So from the context of EU taxonomy, what we've seen so far happening is, as of last year, the delegated acts on the first two environmental objectives around climate change mitigation and adaptation were adopted. And for about 18 months, the platform on sustainable finance has been working on the remaining 4 environmental objectives where we see biodiversity present. So it is the 6th environmental objective that covers the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. There was a report that came out from the platform on the proposed delegated acts. They haven't yet been agreed or put in force, but I think that there is very significant progress being made from an EU taxonomy perspective. And we should also remember that the EU taxonomy regulation is the cornerstone for a number of other regulations impacting the industry. The second key regulation under the Sustainable Finance Agenda is the SFDR, or the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And we believe that this will significantly improve transparency and availability of data, because it requires financial professionals to report on the sustainability risks of their products, as well as of the corporate entity as a whole under the PAIs, or the Principle Adverse Impacts. And from my perspective, the inclusion of biodiversity in the PAIs is very ambitious. It is quite comprehensive. again, acknowledging the context in which our understanding of biodiversity risks is currently. For example, I believe in table 1, which is the mandatory PAIs, there is one specific KPI to biodiversity. There is one on water and one on waste. In the second table, where we then start having a mixture of kind of a more advanced disclosure, most of it is still on a voluntary basis, but participants need to report on at least one of those metrics. There is a more substantial section of biodiversity and nature-related KPIs that the financial participants are expected to report on. And that's where the pressure from them on corporates is so important until corporate reporting picks up. Because we have to acknowledge that we have a little bit of unfortunate situation where financial institutions disclosure is ahead of corporate disclosure. And we have to come up with a solution to mitigate that gap in the interim.
Thank you very much, Elena. I see you got the alternating thing. Now we're diving a bit more, and I hope I'll be forgiven by other Europeans, but a few minutes on France, because France arguably is ahead of the EU on biodiversity. And Charlotte, I know you were involved in drafting the Article 29. Can you tell us more about it and what was the thinking behind it?
Sure, thank you, Lenny. I think I have a slide dedicated to that, right? Yeah, thank you, great. I'll be short. I mean, basically, yeah, France is very proud. I'm not representing France anymore, but to be ahead of the EU in this space. But actually, I think that's a great thing because it shows that biodiversity and climate, again, are very much complementary, though there are different drivers and there are different consequences. But one shouldn't think, one without the other. So what's been done is that, as maybe some of you know, in France, there was a regulation beforehand, before the SFDR, that is called Article 173 of the Energy Climate Law, not on the law on green growth, sorry, that was published in 2015. And when SFDR was adopted or was about to be adopted, we came to realize that there was a need actually to modify the monetary and financial code to adapt our previous framework to the new European framework, because there was an application, scope of application, let's say, that was a bit different. And we took advantage of that to indeed have the Parliament vote on a law that is the Energy Climate Law of November 2019, that includes an article, which is Article 120, which is Article 29, sorry, to progress on this front. It's not just about biodiversity, but I'm going to dig into the biodiversity topic. Indeed, I was in charge of drafting the implementing decree of that article of the law. So basically the technical text that is then mandatory for investors in France to comply with, in addition to SFDR. So it's got a double, dual materiality perspective. First, to the reasoning on biodiversity. I think that's something important to mention firsthand. But then there are two different sets of disclosures that must be done by financial market participants, and it starts this year actually. So first, the publication of a strategy to align the portfolios or the investments, let's say, with international biodiversity conservation objectives with quantified targets. So there is a need to provide details on the scope of the value chain that is selected, to set targets for 2030 and then every 5 years thereafter. There is also a need to measure the alignment with the objectives of the current international treaty of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and a requirement to analyze the contribution to the reduction of the main pressures and impacts on biodiversity. And last but not all, an important point in that strategy is to make a reference to the use of a biodiversity footprint indicator, and if that's applicable, how this indicator does measure alignment with international biodiversity targets. So it's very specific and quite ambitious. And the second part of the disclosures that is provided is to publish a risk management strategy that includes the main biodiversity-related risks from that dual materiality perspective. So there needs to be a clear distinction between the main risks that arise from the impacts that are caused by an investment strategy and the main risks that arise from dependencies on biodiversity of the assets and activities in which the entity has invested. And for each one of these risks that has been identified, there needs to be an indication of the value chain parameter that has been used, and also an indication of whether this risk is specific to the industry or to the geographic area of the underlying asset. So it's quite a very detailed, let's say, implementing text for that article of that law. That's sort of coming on top of what the EU is asking as per SFDR, because SFDR did allow, and mostly based on the French negotiators' questions, let's say, requirements to actually go beyond SFDR, when usually, with the EU regulation, you have to stick point by point to the EU regulation. So this time we had the chance to go beyond that. Obviously, that leads to a series of let's say, practical challenges that are obviously very important. And I think all the points we have raised throughout this seminar actually explain that very well. But let's say the French disclosures in a way could be a good use case to kind of then implement these global frameworks, such as the TNFD, for instance. So looking forward to the first publication in this area.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm looking forward to the first disclosure under Article 29 for sure. I wonder which metrics they are going to use to disclose there. So thank you so much. We have a last question on EFRAG, so the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, who is assisted by the European Commission with the task of coming up with sustainability reporting standards for the EU. Sebastian, we had that question for you. I was wondering if you are still okay to comment, given that we are completely out of time.
Yes, I will try to be short. So, I wanted to react on what Charlotte just said, and I will come to Frank just after. So, yes, I think it's a good thing that Article 29 in France was first, and for us as a financial institution, we know that we can expect big French company to disclose quite a lot of interesting things on biodiversity, and it would be very useful. But we need convergence now. So we need convergence between international targets and standards, because as Charlotte just said, according to Article 29, we need to show that a company is aligned with international biodiversity conservation objectives. And unfortunately, for the time being, with the COP biodiversity being late and always late on it's more and more difficult to have a view on international objectives. And I think that for climate, we have the Paris Agreement with the 2 degrees limit. And I'm convinced that to have relevant disclosures and relevant alignment strategies for companies, we need similar international objectives. And as long as we don't have such international objectives, and unfortunately for the timing, I'm not very confident on what COP15 will be able to deliver. So as long as we don't have such objectives, it's very difficult for a company to define an alignment strategy for biodiversity. And so we need convergence between, yes, expectation and disclosures and international objectives. And we need convergence as well on various disclosure frameworks that are currently being built. So there is TNFD, there is EFRAG. So for the timing, there is a consultation, an ongoing consultation by EFRAG on many different disclosure requirements. One of them is on biodiversity. It's very, very ambitious with many indicators, many targets, and I'm not sure that we have all the relevant tools, all the relevant methodologies to be able to address all these requirements. So here, yes, there is strong request here is we need to develop more methodologies, more KPIs to be able to disclose what is expected from us, companies, and financial institutions. So there is much work to be done to be able to develop relevant methodologies. Otherwise, there will be French text, European text asking companies to disclose many things, but if we don't have the relevant methodologies, we won't be in a position to disclose relevant information. So there is still much work to be done on this topic.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Convergence, it's a big topic, considering all the various standards around the world, the SEC, the ISSB. So we hope as well that with the common periods being close to each other, everyone's commons are going to insist on that point so that we achieve some kind of a common international standard. So we are very out of time. I suggest, so there were a few interesting questions, but just picking up on some of the ideas shared earlier in the webinar about awareness and training. I think there is a lot to be understood. As Charlotte mentioned, these are like complex issues. There is interconnectivity at the global level, sectoral aspects, regional aspects, etc. And to be able to get ourselves as the financial sector profession up to speed on all this, I think training is a key topic. Jessica, I know at your level there are initiatives planned for the following months. Maybe you can say a word on that, and I will check on the chat the questions.
Great. So I'll first talk about banking. It looked like about a third of the participants come from the banking sector. So we have identified the need for capacity building on the topic of biodiversity amongst banking signatories to the principles for responsible banking. So about 280 banks representing about half the banking assets of the world are in the PRB. And last month we launched a 12-month learning journey for PRB signatories. And actually this learning journey covers all different parts of a bank. It can be sustainability, ESG, risk, compliance, legal, front office, any part of a bank are welcome. So most of you should be from a PRB signatory, and you're welcome to join. And the second session is tomorrow. That's on the business case for biodiversity. And the subsequent one will be on risk. And we've had wonderful celebrity speakers, including Sir Bob Watson, who I mentioned. Marissa Drew will speak at the next one. So many of the people that are really thought leaders in this space will be participating over the 12 months. And our objective is actually to get at least one person from all the 280 PRB signatories to sign up. So then now turning to the investor side of capacity building, we have had a webinar series with the PRI, and we are doing a further webinar series with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation and Pledge. So that has covered a range of topics around data, metrics, measurement, readiness of corporates to report to FIs. So I welcome everybody to just take a look at the UNEP-FI channels and see what's available. We also have general materials around using Encore, for example, setting portfolio targets, quite a range. So I do welcome if you want to find me on LinkedIn and get any further information. There are sort of longer term initiatives that UNEP-FI runs, including the environmental and social risk capacity building program, and we are developing a Principles for Responsible Banking Academy, which is will be more like a certified ESG program for banks, similar to the PRI Academy. So that's in the development to be launched shortly. And there are a range of really specific thematic and regional initiatives as well. So I do encourage you to follow the UNEP-FI channel for news, and we should be able to connect you to anything capacity building on these kind of themes, and really specifically lessons learned documents around applying TCFD and now piloting TNFD. So do reach out, and we should have on hand something to give you a hand. Otherwise, network you with one of your peers in the banking or investment community.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everybody. I will try to conclude very quickly as we're pretty much way out of time. If there's one word that comes out for me, it's really complexity. Both of the role of the ecosystem and biodiversity and the links with climate and the links with economy and all the, I'd say, the physical stuff, but also all the regulation stuff. And we see different frameworks coming up, going very fast, very interesting, hopefully pushing for a better future. And I also heard that none of this is an excuse to delay action. So we just have to start investing correctly and wisely and try to make sense out of it. And hopefully everything will converge. I heard the word convergence also. So hopefully all of this will converge soon and for the best. So with that, I would like to thank everybody that's been online today, but particularly our panelists, Anna Clever, sorry, who had to leave early, unfortunately, Charlotte Garde, who's still there, Sébastien Soleil, thank you very much, Elena Filipova, I think you left already, but thank you again, and a double thank you since Refinitiv was sponsoring the event, and Jessica Smith, thank you. All this was extremely interesting. I would also like to thank the people in the back office who help a lot and do a lot of work, and we never see them. So Kylene Ramos, thank you very much. And Sonia Alam, I know you hear me. Thank you again. That said, we will have other events after the summer. So please follow us on LinkedIn. One will come on the S, because I know this year we talked a lot about the E of the ESG. So the next one will be on the S. With an angle on employment. It's a surprise, and a bigger surprise coming just after. So with that said, follow us on LinkedIn. You will receive a satisfaction survey. The replay will be available. Please answer the survey. It really helps us in improving those events. And thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, panelists and audience. It was great to be here with you. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Lenny. Thanks, everyone.